Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the electronics industry, COVID and Brexit. What will 2021 hold? My name is Joe Bush. I'm the managing editor at Electronic Specifier and I'll be your host for today. I think we can all agree that 2020 was a year like no other that threw up some unprecedented challenges for all of us. The electronics sector certainly didn't emerge from the year unscathed, and with much of the UK currently in the middle of lockdown number 3, a degree of uncertainty still abounds. Today we'll be speaking to several industry experts from different areas of the industry who will take a look back on what has been a tumultuous year and look ahead to what 2021 and beyond may hold. To give the point of view of the electronics industry as a whole, our first speaker today will be Adam Fletcher, chairman of the Electronic Component Supply Network, a position he's held since 2005. The ECSN is a not-for-profit industry association whose members are involved in the design, manufacture, distribution and use of electronic components from cradle to grave and rebirth. In 2011, Adam was also appointed chairman of the International Distribution of Electronics Association, a global association of the local country electronic components industry associations that coordinates best practice. Adam, welcome to today's webinar, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. A very good introduction. I'm not sure I guarantee myself an expert, but there's been all sorts of interesting comments about that. Anyway, let's have a little look at the presentation and we'll see how we get on. So, good. So, let's have a look. So we should now start to see the screen that we're working through. We've had a quick introduction to ECSN and what we're about, but we're really there as a member-managed association. So we're very unusual. We were founded in 1970 and we're a virtual organisation, so it employs no people, has no buildings and no offices. So as a result, we keep our costs very low, and that's allowed us to survive for a very long time. And our role is really to promote positive collaboration throughout the electronic components supply network to benefit our members and more widely the UK economy. And that's why we spend quite a lot of time talking to a whole range of publications, is to put the message across about what's happening in our industry accurately and from a non-partisan position. So the first slide I was going to look at was to look at the UK and Ireland electronic components distribution market, what we call the DTAM. And this gives you a very quick view from 1985 right the way through to 2021. And you can see how the market grew through the sort of the 80s and into the 90s and then peaked in 2000 and then declined following the dot-com crash and then followed through as we were going along. And really, what this is telling us, it took us to 2018 really, which was 18 years to recover back to where we'd been in 2000. So quite a long recovery cycle, and this is where we are today, 2020, and this is where we're moving into 2021. So I hope that just gives you an idea of the overall spread within our industry. We also look at, so that was the UK number, this is the European number. And so this is looking at the same data, but only on a 2-year period. And this is looking at what each of the European countries has done. And so this top line is Germany. So you can see Germany is massively larger than any of the other countries in Europe. A little thing called unification helped that very significantly. But here you can see the UK and Italy and France and the Nordic, and we're fairly close. And what's quite interesting is that the UK and Italy are fairly close now in terms of comparisons. So it just gives you a little view on where we sit. If we look at the OECD forecast, we begin to see why there were some fairly significant problems. And if we look down to the UK, where we saw a 12% or 11.2% decline in GDP in 2020, and we're forecast to get a growth of about 4.2% in 2021 of GDP growth, and that's going to grow, they reckon, by another 4% in 2022. So what that tells you is really only growing around about 8 or 9%, so we still haven't recovered the 11% we fell off. If we look at how some of the other players in the business are doing, I mean, quite interestingly, China in 2020, their GDP grew by 1.8%, if you can believe the numbers. And if you compare that to somebody like the US, and the US had a similar fall, not quite as heavily as us, but around about 4%. So it just shows you where we sit. And what I was just trying to show is that if we look at 2021, the world average growth is around about 4.2% of GDP. And interestingly enough, the UK is right on the number. So just a bit of fun. If we look at what's happened or what we're predicting, our members are going to predict happens in 2021, we've got to start to look at what the DTAM spread by quarter was. So this is a much more detailed analysis than you looked at before. These blue bars are what previously happened. So this is growth relative to the prior quarter. And you can see that in Q1 19, we started to turn negative. The growth declined. And that was after a long period of growth, really, through 2016 and 2017 and into 2018. We saw it begin to tail off, and we've seen the real peak occurred in Q2 and Q3 20. And to give us a bit of a forecast forward, we've got to figure out where we end the year, because we're doing the forecast in December before we have the data for the year end. So we're having to predict where the year end will be. And from that, we can then predict what we think is going to happen in the first quarter, the second quarter. And this data here is really guidance, because the market visibility in the UK was so poor in 2020. We had great difficulty forecasting where it's going to be. But what this tells you is that in round terms, in the first half of the year, so that's up to this point, we think we're going to have grown in the range -2% to +4%. So the midpoint is 0.5% growth, which is very, very small. It's almost a statistical anomaly, but we're saying that at least we're moving into we think we'll be in a growth phase. As we move forward into Q3 and Q4, we've provided our best guidance. And that best guidance says that over that period, we're going to have seen much, much stronger growth. And the overall 2021 result will be growth in the range 0 to 6.5%, which again is a modest growth. And I think that around about 3 or 4% is probably not far away, given that the OECD was talking about 4% GDP growth. That does cause me a bit of concern, because this would suggest that we're under what the OECD are now forecasting for the UK. And that's unusual, because typically electronic component markets grow as a multiple of GDP. They normally grow somewhere between 2 and 3 times as fast as GDP, just because electronics are becoming more pervasive, so they tend to outgrow the market. So that's our best guidance, and we've tried to be fairly conservative about the numbers that we throw to people, because we're trying to give a what we think is our best estimate, and that is currently where it is. There are a couple of issues that I'd like to just bring up for you, and this is one that is causing me concern. So if we look at this pink line looks at the forecast billings by quarter going back historically. And the historic trend in the UK is always to see strong growth in Q1 and strong growth in Q2. And the growth then tails off in Q3 and falls off again in Q4. And if you look at 2020, much the same again, strong growth in Q1 and Q2, and then tails off in Q3 and Q4. What troubles me about the picture for 2021 is that we're seeing very modest growth in the first half of the year, and a much, much stronger growth in Q3 and Q4. That troubles me, because if you look at the European market, the US market, and the Japanese market, we all tend to move in a very similar cycle today. That is, that we all experience growth in the first and second quarters, and then a slowing of growth into the third and fourth quarter of the year. That is counter-cyclical to what happens in Asia Pac. So Asia Pac now represents well over 50% of the electronic components market. China by alone counts for 50%, and when you add in the other countries within the region, you're probably getting close to sort of 55 to 60% of the world market is supported into Asia Pac. Asia Pac typically has a very slow Q1 and Q2, experiences all its growth in Q3 and peaks in around about October, November, and then goes into decline into the following year. So why this troubles me is it tells me that instead of being counter-cyclical, this year the electronic components market is all going to go into a growth phase together. And when we all move into a growth phase together, that's going to really push the availability of electronic components. Manufacturers just won't have the capacity to keep up. And when you then add into that the likely 5G rollout, that is the building of 5G handsets and 5G infrastructure, which is all forecast to start towards the second half of 2021, that could drive this number very high and could really start to impact the availability of electronic components. So what we've seen in previous years is because the Western economies grow in Q1 and Q2 and decline in Q2 and Q3 and Q4, whereas the Asia Pac cycle is low Q1, low Q2, high Q3, drops in Q4 and drops. What we're going to see is everybody coming together, and the aggregate demand from everybody is going to become quite a problem, I think. So that's what I would suggest people need to look out for. So there are lots of things looking that we need to think about. How good was the Brexit deal? And we know that's there. There's not much we can do about it. COVID-19 will continue to have little lumps and bumps for us, but at least we understand a little bit more about it, but we don't understand quite how it will impact us. How the US trade policy, will it change with respect to China, or are we going to see some more difficult discussions between the US and the way that they're licensing their technology? I think we need to just monitor that and see how it happens. And then consumer and investor confidence, which really has been fairly high. So what we can say is authorised distributors have done a very good job of buffering their customers thus far. In the UK, authorised distributors are sitting on around about 3 months average customer demand in the UK in terms of inventory. So we have a good amount of inventory there to support people, which will support us through. And we have pipeline of inventory coming in from the manufacturers that they represent. So in theory, we shouldn't really start to get impacted by lead times until they jump very, very badly. So that's really what I'm just saying is, there's lots of opportunity, lots of new design opportunities happening in the market. Electronics continues to be all pervasive. Things are getting a little bit more difficult to get. I think they'll continue to be. And I think that what I would suggest, you're going to see proprietary products. Those are products that are single sourced or near single sourced. Will continue to have reasonably good availability, though that may be 20 odd weeks. And you just got to make sure you've got the correct order cover in place. What does cover me or worry me is the order cover on what I would call the C-class items. And these are really what I would call mass market commodity products. And I'm thinking there in terms of things like chip capacitors and chip resistors and components that are very low unit price but used in very high volumes. Because they're just launched on the market with very little control, I think they're the ones that are likely to have a very, very extended lead time. And so, as a manufacturer of products, you can have 99% of your bill of materials and be stuck for one very silly, small, inexpensive part. You can't build the boards. So, it's a big challenge for the procurement and logistics folks to make sure that they've got the right inventory profile and inventory pipeline to make sure that their organisation can continue to build and prosper. And what I would really end my discussion with is to say, please talk to your supply network partners, both up and down your supply network, about what it is, what you need, what you're trying to do, what your aspirations are. Because by doing that and talking to everybody, we can all move forward and move forward successfully. So thank you very much for your interest, and we look forward to talking, taking any questions you may wish to raise with us.
Thank you, Adam. That was great. Always interesting to get a snapshot of the market. Just to kick off with a few questions. You mentioned briefly their lead times. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about some of the reasons behind why lead times are extending so rapidly for many electronic components.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the reasons we lead times relatively have been stable for the last probably 10 or 12 years. In fact, they've been unrealistically low. For many people, a whole generation of procurement folks have grown up on the basis that lead time is 2 to 4 weeks if it's not ex-stock. That's not historically been the case. Historically, there's been significant movements in lead time. If you go back 15, 20 years or so ago, the only thing you could say is that when you had a change in lead time, you could see it coming. Yeah, it took about 6 months. You saw the lead time suddenly step out in one of the prime markets like America, and you knew that lead times in Europe were going to follow. It was just a matter of waiting a few months. The difference today is lead times change digitally. So what was 2 weeks today could be 6 weeks tomorrow, and 20 weeks 2 weeks later. So they step out very quickly. What we've seen is really a steady uptick in demand, but because that demand's been unstable, component manufacturers, especially in mass market, merchant market commodity products, have been very reluctant to invest in capacity because they've got no certainty of return. And so they've held back their investment. And as this demand begins to increase, they won't be able to cope with it. So what we saw happen in the third, or towards the end of the third quarter, early start of the fourth quarter in the UK, is we saw lead times that had been around about 10 weeks suddenly jumped to 16, which, okay, that's interesting. Why is that happening? And what's happened, what drove that was really that the Chinese New Year holidays in many big organizations were either postponed or extended. And so what they did is many organizations actually paid their workers to stay and not go on a New Year's holiday, and so kept building through it. Others knew that the time was going to be extended, so going from a week to 2 weeks. So they wanted to build further, and so they pulled a lot of more material in, and that caused this little flip in the lead time. Now, I'm one of a very small number of people who think that is a blip. There are other people who say, no, this is just going to continue to get worse. I suspect that in this quarter, as demand in Asia just falls, as it naturally tends to fall at this time, the lead times will come back a bit, and they'll come back from being around 16 to 20 weeks to probably being in the 12 to 16 week area. What troubles me is as we get out towards the middle of the year and starting to go into Q3, I think the demand might be so hard that we're going to see the lead times really exponentially jump out, and they're going to go, instead of going fairly slowly, what we're going to see is products that were on 16 weeks are suddenly going to go to 30. Yeah, and that's a problem. Now, why? This doesn't help anybody in the market. It doesn't help the component manufacturers, the authorized distributors, the customers. It helps nobody. But what tends to happen is that organizations' ERP systems are very linked to what the lead time value put in. That calculates all the safety stock, the order cover, and what buffers they're holding. So if you're a UK-based manufacturer and you put in the lead time for multi-layer ceramic capacitors is 16 weeks, it gives you a window which it wants to purchase forward. When you then tell it, actually the lead time for this is now 30 weeks, it wants to purchase even more. And that has a net result of driving the whole thing forward. And then we get in this daft scenario of double ordering and everything else, which doesn't help people. And then when supply actually catches up with the demand, which it always does, eventually the capacity catches up, then the demand all falls off again and we drop back down, horribly cyclical, and it really doesn't help people. So my best advice to people is, watch lead times very carefully, because I think, it looks difficult. It's looking more difficult than it has. And please talk to your supply network partners, about what's happening and what they're seeing and what you're seeing, because by communicating, we're going to do well. The other problem that we have in Europe and in North America is that we are building typically industrial, automotive, military, aerospace type systems, and they tend to have a much longer life in terms of how long their life cycle in production and when they're with the consumer or the user is very long. Whereas in Asia Pac, most of the products they're building are for this consumer and mobile telephony, and these products are a very short lead time, a very short lifetime. And so what we're seeing is the components that sit in these are very different. The components that we've designed into products in Europe, 5 or 6 years ago, aren't really, and were 5 or 6 years ago, was seen as a very valid product to put in and in high volume. Today, they're not, because the consumer mobile telephony products are getting smaller and demanded in much higher volume. And so we're being left with a lot of what I would call legacy products here. And if you're a manufacturer of components, you're going to be focusing all your output on the highest value, highest revenue generating products. And that means that, the legacy products will be left. This lead time product problem gets exacerbated because the manufacturer is focusing all its effort on the mass market, high volume product for the very largest customers who demand it and can, be penal about what they do to them. And us, in Europe and North America and the industrials, we're in the legacy products. We're come on guys, please help us. We're not able to command the same leverage that we perhaps used to.
Indeed, sure. And from the point of view of the authorised distributors, what have they been doing and what are they continuing to do to maintain operations during the COVID-19 lockdowns?
Well, almost everybody has been very pragmatic, and their employees have been extremely pragmatic too and worked very hard. So we very quickly managed to get everybody out working where we could from home. Most of the industry works on a product called Microsoft Teams pretty exclusively. That seems to have worked extremely well for many people. It's enabled people to seamlessly communicate and connect. And so we had to have a policy of getting where we could people away from the offices, which we've done. Where we've got people in logistics operations, they obviously need to be there. So we had to put in place all of the relevant steps to ensure that they could work safely and be distanced and have shifts overlapping and have people covering other roles so that if somebody wasn't available. So what most people have done is they've separated their logistics people into different teams, and they have different start and finish times, and they're isolated, and some come in and some are out, so they're never all on site together. So that makes it a little bit safer. But even when you're working in a team with the more virulent forms of COVID, we've still got a problem where you could take out quite a lot of people in your team overnight. And so this ability to have redundancy within the operation is very, very important. And I see most authorised distributors probably have a bigger risk in the actual physical picking, packing, checking, assessment of goods rather than they do in the offices. If somebody's out of the office, virtually, any of us could take over to look at the systems and make the systems work. Whereas actually working in the manufacturing operations is a lot harder and takes a lot more thought. But by and large, it's been really well accepted by everybody, and employees across, all the employees of these organisations have worked very hard to try and maintain very high levels of service to their customers. And in fact, most customers have worked very hard. They've all been operating as well. So through this slowdown, if we look at the revenue number for 2020, we were about 8% off the number. We're about an 8% decline in 2020, which says that actually the electronics industry was actually still fairly busy all through the pandemic, which means we must have been able to manage the process reasonably well, or we wouldn't have been able to achieve that result.
Indeed, absolutely. And just going to, one of the other massive topics over the last year or so, the issue of Brexit. Have you received any feedback from your members over the trade deal that was announced at the end of 2020? And as a result, does the future look any clearer with that regard?
Okay. Well, you have to remember that electronic components, by their very nature, are traded globally. And so we're very used to trading products on a global basis. And the infrastructure that all of the authorized distributors have in order to manage this is pretty seamless. We had a big push about 15 years ago with the UK government and HMRC, because of what we could see happening in Europe and internationally, that we needed to get all the documentation done automatically. All needed to be generated automatically. It had to be done via IT systems. Manual systems was just not going to cut it. Just the sheer volume of product we were shipping was huge. So we worked with UK government, HMRC, and the tax authorities across Europe and across the world to set up a thing called authorized economic operator status. And this was a fairly hard thing to achieve, but it effectively meant that when you achieved it, that wherever you imported and exported goods, they weren't really inspected, but the customs authorities had access to all your systems. So you pre-warned them of imports coming in. When they came in, they digitally matched and they went straight through. So they almost go through what I would call a blue channel. They weren't inspected, they just went straight through. And that's worked reasonably well. The facts worked extremely well. And the reason that they want to do that, it might seem like a sort of strange idea, but A, it was to automate it, and B, it was to automate the collection of VAT, right? Because there are different VAT rates across Europe and across the world. If we had a different thing to call it, but across Europe, the VAT rate can range from 15 to 22%, depending on where you import it, where the importer of record is. And so quite often goods will come into the UK and then go to a warehouse in Germany or shipped to a customer in Germany. We've got to be able to track the VAT movement on those goods as they move through the system. And you're also trying to track VAT in two areas. You're trying to track the VAT that you paid for it as the goods came in, the purchase price, the cost price, and then the price at which you're selling at, you've got to pay VAT at. So the tax authorities are very keen to see all that information. So that was one of the benefits of authorized economic operator. It made it very open to the tax authorities. And that's helped us a lot, because it's meant for many years, because there are no tariffs on electronic components. I think there's a very small number of very high performance military products where there's some tariffs, but 99.9% all components, there are no tariffs. So what you're really looking at is, are the goods going to the right destination? Are the goods what they say they are? And is the VAT going to be apportioned correctly? Are the taxes that are paid in the local country correct? And are they being managed correctly? So from that perspective, we've got a very good system in place, and really changing to the EU deal shouldn't really impact that. Now, we have seen some secondary problems, and that is just because you can't get lorries through ports, and so goods that are coming from Europe with product we're trying to send to Europe in lorries has been held up a little bit. But what we've also seen is that most of our products are air freighted. They're fairly light, and so we air freight a lot of our products around, but that's imposed a lot more cost because the number of flights are lower. So air freight, along with all shipping rates, have gone up very dramatically. So there's a much higher cost of shipping at the moment for everybody. But really, we're not seeing massive problems. And as I said, UK and European-based distributors have recognised that there could be delays with Brexit, and so have put buffers in. So we're sitting at probably the highest level of inventory in authorised distributors we've been at for probably 2 or 3 years, where we're sitting on somewhere around about 12 weeks of average consumer demand. So, if nothing happened, we didn't get any shipments and we could survive for 3 months. Well, that's never going to happen. As we shipping out to many thousands of customers, we've got supplies coming in pipeline from the manufacturers. So theoretically, it shouldn't be a problem. one of the things that sometimes comes up is place of origin. Well, place of origin is already defined on all our products. Very few of them come from Europe, actually. Most of them have come from Asia Pac. But the place of origin or point of origin is always shown on the CFC, the Certificate of Conformance, and that's part of the standard data pack that goes backwards and forwards as an authorised economic operator anyway. That's all encompassed within it. So I don't really see there being too many problems with Brexit other than some, what I call last mile logistics.
Indeed, sure. Major event obviously on the horizon. If we go across the pond, there's a new president waiting to take up residence in the White House. Have there been any projections on what this will mean for the electronics industry, particularly with a view to the ongoing trade disputes between the US and China?
I bit outside of my remit, if I'm really honest, but I mean we can look at it as an observer. I would suggest that I don't think there'll be much change. I think that the Chinese authorities have allowed quite a high level of intellectual property infringement in the past, and it needs to be corrected quite significantly. And I think that a lot of what was done by the US administration, though it's been painful, is actually bringing China into line with international trade rules and legislation. I think the only thing I'm a little bit concerned is we seem to be, or some of the legislation seems to be a bit dominant towards one or two companies in Asia, which I think might not be in our long-term best interest. I think we have to try and do this fairly neutrally, and or at least apply it universally across all organisations in the area. Rather than by focusing on specific ones who, for whatever reason, we don't like or feel are a threat. I think we have to just be a little bit more careful. So I don't think there'll be, my gut feel is I don't think there'll be a massive change in heart. I think the strategy for negotiation may change a little bit. The way that they do it may change a little bit, but ultimately we have to find a way for China to operate using international laws and norms, because if they don't, it will hamper their growth, and it will cause a problem for all organisations and all countries that are trading with them. We have to try and do it on a fairly level playing field, and I think that whilst people may be critical of the previous president's process of getting things done, it did actually bring people to the table, and it has actually got some things done that have been discussed for a long period of time with very little activity. I think there is now a recognition that it is helping, though in the short term there's pain, and there's pain very much felt in our industry. But I think longer term, I think everybody will win. And when I say everybody, I mean Chinese organisations and the rest of the world will all benefit from working on a level playing field where we all work together, because there's a lot of intellectual property coming out of China now, and so they want to protect that intellectual property. So I think that between everybody, I think we have to find a way forward. But I think it's just how you do that. That's a challenge.
Sure. And Adam, just to perhaps wrap up, looking at the overall industry, are you predicting that the electronic components market will grow in 2021?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No shadow of a doubt. It's the magnitude of that growth that I can't predict. I mean, if I had to put an absolute guess on it, I would guess that the global electronic components market in 2021, and I'm just making a pure guesstimate, I would think would be in the range 8 to 12% with a midpoint at 10. But I could be an order of magnitude off. and I say that having seen, if COVID was sort of, damped down everywhere and it was played out, and it was, things were, growth was coming up, and 5G really comes on, I think we're going to see an enormous amount of pent-up demand come out, and you could see growth in our industry really at a really strong point at sort of say 15-20%. The trouble is we couldn't service that growth. Yeah, I think that we have capacity within the international electronics business to grow probably realistically up to about 10 points. The moment we get over 10 points, we're really going to struggle to add the capacity on, and getting that capacity on in the places that we need it isn't quick. It's going to be capacity that takes a year or so to come on stream. And that's the real nub of the problem. This isn't a quickly solvable solution, which is why I'm saying to people, just be very careful and watch carefully what's happening in the market, and talk to your partners in the supply network, because they're going to provide you with the best intelligence, because this rocking up and down of supply and demand is just horrific for everybody, and it impacts everybody's costs. It really does. Nobody benefits from this at all. It's just a disaster. What all organizations want is stability. We want stability with known demand and known outcomes. When we get into these unknown unknowns, it just makes it very expensive for everybody. It really does.
Okay, indeed. Communication is key.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam. That is all we've got time for today, but that's really, really appreciate your time, and always great to get some insight into the ECSN. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and we look forward to talking to you again. Cheers.